Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 Constitution Day panel at UL Lafayette and the College of Liberal Arts. Our topic today is political polarization. Is this causing the US to be headed toward civil war? We've got two panelists today who are going to present a couple of opinions, and then they're going to engage in a dialogue on this. First, I'm going to introduce both our panelists, and then we'll hear from each of them. First, I'll introduce Wally Stewart, Dr. Wally Stewart, who is Director of Civic Engagement at Focus, St. Louis. Dr. Wally Stewart has more than 2 decades of experience with civic and political engagement from the grassroots and applied levels to academic analysis and theory. From 2011 to 2017, Dr. Stewart was the director of the Center for Ethics in Public Life at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. During that time, CEPL, which is the Center for Ethics in Public Life, established itself as a statewide hub for public ethics information, conferences, workshops, research, best practices, legislative tracking, community collaboration, and more. So they really got down into the nitty-gritty about what was happening there. Prior to arriving in St. Louis in 2011, Wally earned his PhD in political philosophy and ethics from the University of California at Santa Barbara. Prior to his postgraduate work, Dr. Stewart worked as a political organizer and lobbyist for a network of state-level grassroots consumer justice organizations, including 2 years that he did as campaign director for the Coalition of Consumer Justice of Rhode Island. Wally's most deeply held political beliefs are not about policy, but about political process, about what it takes to create cooperation among co-citizens while simultaneously respecting every individual's right to pursue his and her own personal conception of the good. Our second speaker today, second panelist, is our very own Dr. Richard Frankel, who is a professor of history here at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Dr. Frankel specializes in the history of modern Germany, with particular interests in nationalism, anti-Semitism, and political culture. His first book, Bismarck's Shadow, The Cult of Leadership and the Transformation of the German Right, 1898 to 1945, looked at the ways in which the image of Otto von Bismarck was manipulated and used by various political actors, primarily on the right, to advance their own agendas. Ultimately, it shows how the cult of Bismarck helped prepare the ground for the rise and eventual success of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Professor Franklin then turned to the study of anti-Semitism, comparing development in Germany and the United States during the first half of the 20th century. In numerous articles and papers, Rich has pointed to remarkable similarities in the anti-Jewish environments of both countries. His current book project explores the relationship between anti-Semitism and globalization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with a focus on Germany and the United States. Dr. Stewart is a visitor to us, so we thought we'd let Dr. Stewart, Wally, go first. And so I'm going to turn the microphone over to him. And then I think he's going to turn it over to our own Dr. Frankel. But first, I'd like to remind our viewers that most of you are familiar with the Zoom format. And if you look across the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there's a chat feature, but there's also a little further along to the right at the bottom there's a question and answer feature. While you're listening to our speakers in the first part, and as they get into their discussion in the second part, at any time, if you would like to ask a question, either now or to be held till later, we'll be watching this. So you just enter your question into the Q&A feature down at the bottom of the page, and we'll do our best to get to your questions from there. Okay, so first up, again, is Dr. Wally Stewart. Wally?
All right, thank you very much, Sally. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, so hopefully you all can see Mr. Snowden. So to bring myself into the room just a little bit, I have been a professor. I've done a lot of nonprofit work. So I've done politics from kind of both ends of the scale. The tippy top of the ivory tower, right? In philosophy departments, we don't even do data. That's too dirty for us, right? Pure conceptual analysis. What is justice? What is the nature of a just society? And kind of the other end of the scale, street level, grassroots political organizing. I've kind of lived in both of those worlds. Out of the connection of those two, I've built a series of workshops that help people explore how to think about values in public spaces, and specifically how they divide us, how they unite us, how we think about them, and how they're used to manipulate us. So I'm gonna play with a couple of those concepts here in my first 10 minutes today. And in order to do that, I am not only going to share my screen with a PowerPoint, but I'd like to actually get the audience involved as well. So audience members, in order to prepare for a piece that you're going to have to do, I'm going to ask you to open up a new screen or a new browser window on your computer, or if you want to use your phone, open up a browser window there and go to menti.com, MENTI.com, and go ahead and enter the code 48937737. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat so that you can have that and do that. So menti.com is the website. The code you're going to enter then is 48937737. There you go. So that's in the chat. I'm going to ask you to open up that browser window. Now, the reason that I have Edward Snowden up here at the moment, because I want to ask you a question about him. And just to remind you in terms of what actually happened back in 2013 with Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden was a private contractor who worked for Booz Allen, which is a private contractor for the NSA, the National Security Agency. In his work at Booz Allen, Edward Snowden discovered that the NSA had been secretly accessing Yahoo and Google data centers to collect information from hundreds of millions of account holders worldwide by tapping undersea cables, harvesting millions of email and instant messaging contact lists, searching email content, and tracking and mapping the locations of cell phones. So he decided to go ahead and become a whistleblower and let the public know that this was happening, despite the fact that he had been sworn to secrecy. In June 2014, the NSA's director, US Navy Admiral Michael Rogers, said that while some terrorist groups had altered their communications to avoid surveillance techniques revealed by Snowden, there was and as a result of that, they could see that there had been significant damage done to their ability to collect information, possibly prevent future attacks, but not the kind of damage to conclude that the sky is falling. So here is my question for you. If you go to menti.com and enter that number, it will pull up a code for you, and you can answer that question. For leaking information on the NSA's activities, Edward Snowden is best described as an A, traitor, B, criminal, C, misguided soul, D, conscientious citizen, or E, hero. And I see that 3 of you have responded so far. At this point, if you'd like to go ahead and participate, I would ask you to. I'm going to give you just a couple more seconds. All right, 3, 2, 1, and I'm going to go ahead and bring my screen share over to the other screen and show you where we ended up. Okay, we are all over the board. Wow, you are a statistically very well-behaved audience for a relatively small audience. So we do have a plurality, i.e. the largest on any single choice, but not a majority on conscientious public citizen. And then folks walking from there all the way over through misguided soul and criminal to traitor. Very interesting. Now, the reason that I bring up Edward Snowden is not necessarily to go ahead and decide what we think Edward Snowden is and what the correct answer is. As I'm bringing up this polling, I really want to make sure you know this is not a quiz. There is never one single right answer. I'm asking these polls to try to kind of pull and push at your moral instincts just a little bit. The reason I bring up Edward Snowden is his is a really good illustration of something happens in the public sphere all the time that creates a lot of the tension that we see in the public sphere and in the political debates. And that is that no matter how you decided to evaluate Edward Snowden, whether you think he's a hero or a traitor, have the moral humility to step back and believe that Edward Snowden considered himself to be in what we theorists call a morally tragic situation. A morally tragic situation is one in which there is no clean moral choice. The paradigmatic example of a moral tragedy was created by Jean-Paul Sartre, and it's a boy forced to choose between caring for his mother on her deathbed or signing up to defend his country at war. Either way, he believes he's betraying someone, his mother or his motherland. Edward Snowden considered himself to be facing the same kind of choice. Betray either the government or his fellow citizens. Now, the reason that this kind of moral tragedy comes up all the time in the public sphere is because democracy is designed to be a morally tragic situation. In fact, I like to say democracy in the United States is an ongoing moral tragedy filled with paradox and conflict, and that's how we know it's working. And what I mean by that is there are fundamental values conflicts built into the very idea of democracy that are irreconcilable. Here's the fundamental ethical question of government and democracy. How do we ethically protect the social cooperation that makes our society cohesive and strong, while also respecting the rights of individuals to pursue vastly divergent visions of the good life and deeply conflicting moral and political beliefs? Democracy is a moral tragedy. It's a paradox. Think about the first person who tried to build a democracy. Hey, everybody, I've got this great idea. We're going to get together. We're going to call each other co-citizens. We're going to choose some common goals, and we're all going to pull in the same direction. Oh, and you're all individuals, and you get to do whatever you want. See the conflict? It's unavoidable, and it is irresolvable, and it should be, because the moment that we resolve that conflict, we lose a democracy. If we resolve the conflict entirely in favor of individual freedom, we end up with a non-governmental kind of free-for-all. If we resolve this conflict entirely in favor of government power, we end up with complete government power. That's the fundamental paradox built into the idea of government, and it's irresolvable, and we should not try to resolve it. But we can map out some of the ways in which it conflicts. So I'm going to do one more piece here, and then I'll hand it over to Rich. When I do these public values workshops, I promise people at the beginning that I'm going to hand them a map of values in the public space that has two features. Number one, you can take any controversy in the public sphere and map it onto this list of values. And number two, it doesn't matter where you are in the political spectrum, you will recognize these as our foundational values. The first two categories of those values, so that's a list of values in three categories that constitutes that map, constitute this conflict. So there are personhood values, right? Based on the idea of the individual being the fundamental good. These include things like liberty. If I'm a person because I have the ability to choose my own ends and pursue them, I need the liberty to do that. Fairness and equality are personhood values. If I recognize in myself the ability to choose my own conception of the good, and I also recognize that in you, I am required to put you on a level moral playing field. Personal rights are a way of kind of mapping out that personal space I need in order to exist as an individual. On the flip side, we have what we call outcome values. Now, at the foundation of outcome values is not a person, but people's well-being. Which doesn't seem like much of a difference, right? Usually what's good for a person is good for their well-being. But if you make that distinction at the very bottom of your moral framework, you get very different answers. So outcome values include things like our communal well-being, right? Everything we need as a society to exist well. Our security and economy, our health, our environment, jobs, water, air, all of those things. And they also include, because these usually come in the form of a cost-benefit analysis, the idea of effectiveness and efficiency. These are the two of the three kinds of values we have in the public sphere. They constantly come into conflict, not just between two values, but two fundamentally different kinds of values. And here's why. If you take a paradigmatic statement of personhood values, it says each person possesses an inviolability founded on justice that even the welfare of society as a whole cannot override. On the flip side, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. You see why this conflict is built in? There is no way to reconcile that conflict. All we can do is try to balance it on a day-to-day basis. And America has been doing this and in turmoil about this since its very inception. So my fundamental point here is, yes, we are currently in a trend, which a lot of data will show you, of hyperpolarization and division in this country. Number one. Number two, that's not new for us. Our country has been struggling with these concepts for its entire existence. The latter half of the 20th century is a bubble. It's a kind of peaceful little bubble we had where there was a lot of wealth, there was peace, there was a global accord that seemed to be keeping things mostly peaceful as long as you were first world and white. That bubble is bursting right now a little bit, but that doesn't mean we're going to an unprecedented place in our country's history. It just means we're going to go back and once again revisit these foundational conflicts in the very idea of democracy. And with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. I'm going to ask Dr. Frankel to join us now.
Yes. Hello.
Hey, Rich.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this, and to Wally for setting this up. Presenting these issues in very broad terms. I am also going to speak, at least for now, in some broad terms. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a historian who deals with issues of political culture, for example, and who does it primarily from the perspective of modern Germany. And for a long time, that was an area that didn't necessarily lend itself naturally to comparison with the United States, certainly not the contemporary United States. But unfortunately, it's become more so over the last 5-6 years, in particular with the rise of Trump and his victory in 2016. And so, I've certainly seen more and more important points of comparison with our recent experiences in the United States and the experiences of Germany, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s. And that those points of comparison, I think, have only grown more noticeable in recent years. They haven't weakened, they've gotten stronger. And so, I can certainly, talk about really specific aspects of where German history sort of coincides or has, all kinds of lessons to teach us about today. But I wanted to also just at least present a few features of the current situation that I think are at the heart of our problems right now, and why we have this question, whether the United States is on the path to civil war, a question that I think even you know, 7, 8 years ago would have seemed, you know, outlandish. And it's not outlandish, even if you don't think it's necessarily going to happen. You know, the viability of the question, right, I think is, or the legitimacy of the question is there. I mean, I think what we see now in the United States is a particular moment where nationalism and identity have become fluid again, and therefore the setting of boundaries, the setting of in and out groups is once again happening. You know, nationalism has been at the heart of this country since the beginning, and nationalism in terms of, you know, having a state for a particular national group, Americans. You know, that's something that's always going on in terms of defining, right, what it means to be an American, who's an American, who's a real American, and so forth. Many, you know, for many periods of time, it's not really that significant on a day-to-day basis. You know, there's general periods of kind of general agreement, or at least where the struggle is, at least for the moment, sort of under the surface. But there are periods, of course, when that resurfaces, and those struggles over who's in and who's out take center stage. And of course, these questions are fundamental. They're critical. Who's in and who's out, right? Who's a member of the national community? Who gets to enjoy rights? Who gets to vote? Who gets to actually exist within the boundaries of the state? These are all fundamental questions related to this issue. And of course, we're seeing this now. You know, what, you know, people talk about real Americans and so forth. And that relates to another issue, which is fundamental to the functioning of a healthy democracy, and that is issues of legitimacy, right? The legitimacy of the government, right? Yes, as Wally pointed out, you have disagreements, and you have some fundamental disagreements, right? Of course, in a healthy democracy, the requirement is compromise, right? Because again, you can't have the victory of one over the other completely. In order, at its most basic, the most basic compromise, of course, overall, is the acceptance of the system as legitimate, right? That the government system as it exists is legitimate, right? We accept that there is, you know, there are multiple positions and multiple political parties, and that at sometimes one political party is going to be, you know, in charge, and another time it's going to be the other. And you don't agree, obviously, with each side, but you do accept the legitimacy of the other side. You do accept the legitimacy of elections, right? And the idea is to contest those elections, and again, to contest those values and policies and so forth. But what we're seeing now is really, again, one of those moments where one side in particular sees the other as fundamentally illegitimate. You know, we can talk about polarization, and I don't think it's polarization in the way that many in the media portray it, you know, an even split or an even radicalization on both sides. I think clearly the danger is on one side. One side has legitimized its own most radical impulses to a degree that simply does not exist on the left. And it's the right, it's the Republican Party today, for example, that has increasingly come to see its opponents as fundamentally illegitimate, right? That they are not, again, real Americans, and therefore they don't have the real interests of America at heart. They don't win elections legitimately, right? The only way they come to power is through cheating, through undermining the system. And when you believe that your opponents are fundamentally illegitimate, you don't have to obey them, right? Their rules are illegitimate by definition, right? The laws that they establish are illegitimate by definition. And if you see them as illegitimate, or even further down the line in terms of radicalization, and I think this is certainly the case today, not just as illegitimate, but as traitors, right? As outsiders, as un-American, and as traitors, right? Well, you can't have obviously a government run by traitors. By definition, they are going to undermine the best interests of the nation, right? Because they don't belong. And therefore, if you believe your government to be in the hands of traitors, of outsiders, then anything that's done to stop them and ideally to remove them is legitimate. Right? How can you can't sit back and accept, traitors in charge by definition. And so that leads to another feature of today's politics, which is the acceptance of violence as a legitimate expression or a legitimate political practice. And again, I think this, despite some of these polls, that also I believe to be the feature of one side far more than the other. And we've seen it already because one side has been acting in that way for years now, and even before January 6th, but obviously January 6th being the biggest example of that. And, of course, you can't have healthy politics when one side is willing to use violence and therefore, in a sense, shut down rational discussion, right? If the other side is in fear, right, of their physical safety. And the last point just to make that relates to a lot of this is a fundamental rejection of a common reality, right? And again, this is something that really exists overwhelmingly on the right. You have a right-wing media universe that has by now completely self-enclosed, in which those who are inside are being fed and come to believe a set of facts that are simply completely unrelated to the real world, right? And in fact, belief in those, those ideas has become sort of a marker of belonging within that political community, right, of Republicans, which is now dominated obviously by Trump. Regardless of what you actually think of the issue, expressing belief in these myths, in these legends, in these conspiracies is a fundamental marker of belonging. And when you have, one side that believes in a set of facts, in a reality that is completely detached, once again, you cannot have a healthy functioning democracy, right? You can't argue with someone who does not accept the same basic facts, right? You can't have compromise with someone who does not accept the same basic facts and who believes in a world of conspiracies and so forth that are by definition unprovable. Right? And so I think these are four features, and these are also four features that I would argue were very much present in the German situation in the 1920s and 1930s. And that's, again, where I see lots of troubling comparisons. And not to say that it's exactly the same by any means, but these general features were there as well. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, thank you, Dr. Frankel. I'm going to ask both of our panelists to join us on the screen if we can, because we're going to try to open the conversation up a little bit now. Our panelists can have a dialogue here, but it would be so much more interesting if we could open this up to some of our participants as well. So I'm going to remind everybody to post your questions and comments to the Q&A section. We have one to start with that we can throw out to both of the panelists to begin a dialogue with. And that is on, really, we've heard the nature of democracy. We've heard our panelists talk about the nature of democracy. We've heard about the nature of facts and elections and such. But the question there then arises, what makes this time different or the same? How is it the same from the past times of hyperpolarization? What are we facing today if the nature of democracy is the same, remains the same, facts remain the same, but why is it different now? Or what is the same now? Why are we experiencing it differently? And this is to set up the dialogue between you guys, and then maybe we can get some more participation from our audience in the Q&A as well.
Rich, I'm going to give you the first shot at that.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily new. Again, I'm coming at it from the perspective of someone who looks at, a century ago, right? And not just in Germany, but in the United States back then as well. But in the case of Germany, you had very similar kinds of features in terms of, defining a national community, right? Defining who belongs. In times of crisis, this is what happens. Germany, after a lost war, after a revolution, experienced an economic crisis. This is what they were experiencing. And they had a situation in which a group of, a new government had been created as a result of a revolution that overthrew the old system. These new rulers had been traditionally the outsiders in the old system and had never been considered legitimate, candidates for rule. The aristocrats, the military officers, big business people, they had been in charge for decades, but now they were on the outside, looking in, and they viewed this new government as fundamentally illegitimate. They believed in conspiracy theories that said that these new rulers were in fact the very same people who had stabbed the German army in the back after the First World War, or at the end of the First World War, causing it to lose. Okay? And so they were in fact, according to this line of thinking, very real traitors, right? They hadn't literally betrayed the country. Again, that's not true, but that was the belief. And those beliefs were acted upon, right? That government was seen as fundamentally illegitimate. They were un-German, right? And therefore they did not have to be obeyed, right? And since it was a government run by traitors, violence was legitimate, which is a feature that didn't really exist in German politics before, political violence. That was considered legitimate, and people were murdered in large numbers as a result of this, especially Jews, but not only. And you had also that side that rejected the system essentially refused to participate. Okay? That it saw, no reason to work within the system, a system that they saw as illegitimate. In fact, what they wanted to do was essentially keep the system from functioning. And so they did what they could to gum up the works. They did not understand politics as compromise. Right? They just fundamentally rejected that whole notion, right? And so they either expected to win everything, as we saw already, which is fundamentally incompatible with democracy. But of course, they were not also fundamentally compatible with democracy. They proposed, ideas, they proposed policies, and if they didn't get it, they had no alternative, right? And they simply could not accept a system in which they compromised and they cooperated, because any cooperation would be betrayal, right? If you're working with traitors, you become treasonous yourself. And so you had them working from, in many respects, again, a kind of world that was detached from the real world that Germany had to deal with, which made, of course, the task of those who were willing to work within the system, who didn't necessarily love the system, but were realistic enough to work within it, made it extremely difficult and probably, shortened people's lives, even if they weren't shot, just in terms of health issues and stress, shortened people's lives considerably. And so it's not new, I would say. Again, maybe the means of communications are somewhat different, but you had newspapers back then, which were widespread and published 2 or 3 times a day and so forth. And so news actually did travel quite fast back then. But some of these just fundamental issues, these fundamental challenges that, again, are part of democracy, but at certain times become sort of inflamed, right? And become, as you said, they come to the surface. And from my perspective as a historian, again, there are certainly, small differences and so forth. But fundamentally, these are crises of democracy.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, well said. This is a tough question, and Rich did a really good job of kind of laying out some of those parallels in terms of broad social phenomenon. The thing that strikes me is what's happening now is very similar to what's happened in the past in the sense of what are the fundamental issues at play, right? They're the exact same issues. And I just to throw a few out there, right? What's the issue? It's resource divisions, right? The haves versus the have-nots. It's race. It's public health. If you go back and look at the flyers from the Spanish flu period, the early part of the 20th century, and what they were telling people to do, and what they were guarded against, and what they were responding to, it's the exact same thing. Those flyers say, wear a mask, wash your hands, do not ignore the advice of experts simply because you do not understand. And we've been doing this over and over and over again. Race, right? How many times do we have to reconcile our 200 years of institutionalized white supremacy in this country? We're doing it over and over and over again. The tools this time are different. The flow of information is much faster than it ever has been in the past. And that information is also diversified and unmediated in ways that it never has been in the past. If you want to, you can set up your social media, your news feeds, your internet in ways that will only tell you things that confirm what you already believe. In fact, you don't even have to do that. Your social media algorithms are going to do that for you. That's what they are designed to do. They're designed to feed you things that make you feel good about the opinion you currently hold, and they are designed to not show you things that challenge your opinion. So weirdly, while we have access to vastly more information than we ever have as we're dealing with these things, we also have the opportunity to isolate ourselves in mutually echoing response chambers in ways that we have never had before, right? Internet societies of people from all over the world that believe in certain crazy conspiracy theories can wall themselves off and work themselves up into a lather in ways that they never have done before. On top of that, think about, Rich, you made the really powerful point about violence becoming a legitimate form of political activity. All right, I mean, how to kill a democracy? Confuse your political opponent with your mortal enemy. That's how you kill a democracy. And nowadays, when we're talking about violence, we're talking about people able to arm themselves with weapons of war level armories, as they never have been in this country before. So all of those things come together, and they provide two things. They provide an unbelievable opportunity for us to have a global conversation in a way, a productive global conversation in a way we never had before. They also provide an extreme danger of isolating ourselves in confirmation bias echo chambers in a way that we've never done before, which will leave us more divided. You know, and Rich, you pointed to the fact that of this kind of weird feature, like it's just a weird coincidence that 50% of the people in this country believe one way and 50% of the people in the country believe the other way. That seems kind of odd, doesn't it? It's not a coincidence. This is not a piece of input data to our political system. This is a product of the incentives of our political system. When you have a two-party system, each system is incentivized to create the smallest possible governing majority. They don't want 70% of the people to agree with them or 70% of the people to be in their tent, because then they've got too much disagreement inside that tent and they get anything done, and they get nothing done. They want 51% of the people to be inside their tent so that A, they have power, and B, they have as small and as narrowly defined a set of opinions in that tent to set their agenda by as possible. Our country has been artificially divided into red versus blue. This is not a fact about who we are. This is a fact about who we have made ourselves.
I agree with a number of things there. I think it isn't so much that 50% believe one thing and 50% believe another, especially today. I mean, you have and this again is similar in these kinds of situations where you have about a 30% hardcore of believers, again, on the right, right? Whereas a lot of the things that are presented as, split decisions and controversies, vaccines and so forth, that's not a split. Most people accept vaccines, most people accept masking and so forth. It's presented in that way because there are only two parties and it's half and half. But if you actually look at, again, those people who, again, believe the kind of loony things that Trump and others say, it's not the whole of the Republican Party, and that's a danger for them. They're pandering to a certain hardcore because they're afraid of the violence, among other things. So it can appear that way, again, because you have a two-party system. Again, in German example, you have multi-parties, but I wanted to get actually back to something that's strangely enough similar from the 20s to today that you might not think, and it is this kind of channeling of your preferences and your beliefs, right, and reinforcing it throughout. Yeah, they didn't have, obviously, the internet, they didn't have Facebook and Twitter back then, but a real fundamental feature of German political culture, actually going back to the empire, which wasn't as critical because the empire wasn't a full democracy. It becomes more important in the 20s when it is, and the implications of that are now seen, and that is that you actually did have a situation in which the media, newspapers overwhelmingly, were in fact linked to political parties, right, and the political persuasions. And so you had socialist newspapers and you had left liberal newspapers and right center newspapers and conservative newspapers and Catholic newspapers and so forth. And you read your newspaper, right? If you were a socialist, you read the socialist newspaper. You did not read the liberal newspaper. You didn't read the Catholic newspaper, okay? And so once again, you have a self-reinforcing and kind of channeled political culture in which they are actually being told a view of things that corresponds to their social position and the political position. And again, in a system in which it's not a true democracy, it's problematic. What happens is when it gets carried over into a democracy, then you have the outcomes, which is that, again, they don't talk to each other in that sense. They do believe things that the others aren't even necessarily aware of. And those kinds of conspiracies can thrive, right? And so you did have an extremely divided and segmented political culture in the 20s and 30s in Germany that, in many respects is similar to today. They didn't have Fox News, but they had right-wing newspapers. And once you went into that world, that's what you read. You could literally be on the train and know who everyone voted for just by looking at the newspaper they were reading. Because, a bourgeois German is not going to be caught dead reading a socialist newspaper, right? And that was a reality. And you did have then a kind of breakdown of a sense of common purpose, right? Because they were all in their trench, in a sense, moving forward. So it's a strange similarity, even though it's obviously a more primitive kind of technology.
Rich, excuse me, Rich and Wally, let me break in here for just a moment, because we do have a question from one of our viewers, one of our participants here, and it kind of gets at where y'all are right now. Okay, let's see if I can read it to you. Jaden King wants to know, what role do people have to play in this time of polarization? Should they be more informed, more active, or has the powerful caused something the people cannot take back? So they want to know where to go from here. You've kind of pretty much outlined where we are. So what can we do?
I would go with you. Based on your description, well, you're more inclined toward this. Mine is a little more pessimistic. I'm asked this question a lot in my work on what's going on today, and my answer is probably not going to be as satisfying. So I'd let you go first on this one.
So I gave a TEDx talk that was kind of about this. And my fundamental answer is, yeah, and the fundamental question of the TEDx talk was, is the political fever state we're in terminal? And my answer was, well, let's understand fevers, right? Fevers are terrible and they're painful and they rack your body, but they're also in a lot of ways the only way that your body can extinguish that particular infection, right? So we're gonna go through a period of extreme pain here, and whether that fever kills us or cures us is up to us. And I do still think it's up to us. I still do think that we are not so path dependent at this point, to use a political science term, that we are inevitably on some kind of decline. I think we are inevitably headed towards some kind of, I'll use the word reconciliation, and not in the term of two friends reconciling, but in the other definition of a process by which two conflicting truths can be made to be understood simultaneously. And let me actually, if I may, I'm going to do just a couple of minutes of on one issue where this is particularly salient right now. There's possibly no more divisive issue in the country right now than race and policing. Automatically, if you talk about police, people line up on the pro-cop, anti-cop divide. And so I'd like to do something for a moment here, if I may, if we've got time, and just kind of curious. Let's go to your menti.com, and if you go back on the chat again, go to menti.com, enter the code 483-4893-7737. That's in the chat, and answer that Mentimeter question that I've got right there. Hey, you wake up in the morning, you see a headline, young black man shot by the police. What's your first gut reaction? I'm not asking what your reaction should be. I'm asking for an honest answer. What's your first gut reaction? Now, the reason that I'm going to bring this up, so I'm going to give you a couple of minutes or a couple of seconds to go ahead and answer that, is because, like I said, this is one of the most divisive issues in the country right now. And it's one of those spaces where we have to reconcile two very different views and understandings of the world. So I'm going to give you just a couple more seconds to answer. We're going to go with 3, 2, 1, and stop. And let's go ahead and show those results. Where did we end up? Okay. So we have a majority on the end of give the young black man a benefit of doubt and want to know more, or expect the officer was probably justified. So a pretty powerful majority on the police skeptical end. We've got a very respectable amount of folks that are sitting right there in the middle in terms of staying neutral. Now, I said there was no one right answer to these polls. I didn't say there wasn't a wrong answer. And I'm going to challenge you here a little bit and say that there's probably a wrong answer. And that's the middle answer. Stay objectively neutral. And it's wrong for two reasons. Number one, I asked you for your initial gut reaction. And unless you are a highly mentally disciplined, trained HR professional, for instance, your brain is way out ahead of you on this, and it's making decisions without your say-so. You are not neutral on this. Number two, even if we think about this as what should our response be? Well, our response should not just simply be a blank slate, because where we're coming from right now is not a blank slate. We have 250 years of American history to go by, 200 of which were institutionalized, legalized white supremacy, another 50 of which are de facto white supremacy via Jim Crow segregation. And then from the 70s forward, well, we can talk about that. It's probably a different story. So what does that mean in terms of how we should answer this question? Let me bring us back I'm going to get 2 more minutes here to bring us back to my share screen here. There we go. And we're going to move forward just a little bit. Okay. When you bring up this kind of picture and people are divided, they either line themselves up on the side of the police or the side of the protesters, right? Well, there's two histories here. There's two histories of policing in America. Number one, there's a history of police as heroes, and this is real. Police put themselves out there in the line of fire, put their body in the way of harm on a day-to-day basis. I've worked with police departments. I've taught at leadership schools inside police departments. I have friends who are police officers whose family tell me stories about, their partners sitting at the table trying to keep calm with their kids while they're shaking inside because their partner is coming home late from a shift they knew was going to be dangerous. Policing is a brutal, difficult, underpaid, underappreciated job, and we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. There's also another history. Policing in this country was born in the form of slave patrols and Indian patrols. It was literally born as a way to control Black and brown bodies. In the 200 years of institutionalized white supremacy, the finger on the trigger, the hand on the leash, the hand on the hose were the police. They have to answer for that 200 years at least of institutionalized white supremacy in the form of either slavery or Jim Crow segregation as the enforcers of oppression under color of law. The thing is, both of these histories exist inside one institution, they exist inside one space, and they exist inside one police officer. Reconciliation means getting comfortable with both of those deeply conflicting realities. That's what you can do. Get comfortable with holding this kind of rational schism in your brain. Get comfortable with the discomfort of learning facts that undermine your beliefs and views about the community. Get comfortable with reading things that don't comply with what you see. Let me pull up one last slide here. This is an extremely useful thing, by the way. This is put out by Ad Fontes Media. It's a media bias chart where they attempt to kind of grade media in terms of their bias. And my purpose of putting this up is not to say only read those ones at the top and in the center. That's not the point. But if you read some of those that are down more toward opinion and more toward an ideological bias, make sure you have sources in your feed that are on the other side at that same level. Read all of it. That's one of the first things you can do. Get comfortable with discomfort, get comfortable with cognitive dissonance, get comfortable talking to people that disagree with you, and don't confuse your political opponent for your mortal enemy. All right, I'll stop there. Rich?
Rich, did you want to respond? And you know what, Rich, let me just throw out another challenge to the to our viewers, okay, while you're responding. Why don't we, I think Wally identified the racism, okay, and racial and policing, okay. Let's see, what do some of our participants think are the big challenges today? Enter some of those in the Q&A that you think are the big issues that we need to look at today, and maybe we can gather a few to discuss about. Okay, go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, I mean, I think my thoughts on the issue of what can be done and is a lot briefer than that. I don't know, honestly, because I'm coming at it from the perspective of looking at how do you deal with, or work with people who believe who live within that alternative reality, right? Who subscribe to an alternative set of facts that aren't in touch with reality. And the reality there, I think, is that for those people, you can't. I've given talks about this in my work, and that's the question I always get. And the reality was, again, in Germany too. You can't argue with Nazis. And I'm not saying, obviously, that all the people on the right are Nazis. I'm giving from an historical perspective. Certainly, the people on the right who in Germany who posed the greatest danger to democracy were not people you could rationally argue with. They did not accept the same reality. They didn't accept the same set of facts. And they didn't accept the system itself as legitimate, within which you were operating. And so in those kinds of circumstances, unless they somehow leave that, you can't rationally convince them otherwise, I don't think, certainly not the vast majority. If there are people who are sort of on the bubble, right, who kind of maybe flow back and forth a little bit between, inside the edge of the bubble and outside, that those people might be reachable. But that 30%, I think, certainly, at least for the foreseeable future, are lost. They will not be transformed into, healthy Democrats, small d Democrats, that will be helpful in that sense. And so, yeah, I take a much more pessimistic viewpoint of that. And seeing what's developed over the last few years, again, the situation might have hoped would get better after the election, but it hasn't. So that's, yeah.
Thank you. I'm seeing a couple of things folks have put in the chat.
Yeah, you want to take it, Wally? Take those.
Immigration has always been an issue in the United States. We have always been schizophrenic about immigration. We have always welcomed immigrants as long as they were immigrants like us. And we have always been unwelcome to immigrants if they weren't immigrants like us. We have been othering immigrants in this country for a very, very, very long time. Abortion, a really, really super divisive issue. Interestingly, a lot of people don't realize, kind of a new issue on the American political realm. Up until, say, the 70s, actually, I'm not sure, but somewhere around then, somebody else can probably get more into that. It was pretty specifically a Catholic issue, and it's become a very, very, very powerful issue among Protestant white America, especially rural Protestant white America, in a way that it never was up until about 50 years ago, which a lot of people don't realize. That's a relatively new one. Healthcare got brought up. It's funny, when I do these workshops, after I ask the Snowden question, a couple of hours later into the workshop, I often ask, well, if you had to choose security versus liberty, which would you choose? And it doesn't matter whether my audience is deeply conservative out in rural Missouri, or if it's deeply liberal, if it's one of the big universities here in town. Liberty always has a stronger vote. That streak got broke, that several year-long streak got broken this past weekend by a group of people who suddenly decided that they probably lean more towards security over liberty. And I know that that's the pandemic talking. So it's just fascinating to me that this issue being brought up has fundamentally shifted where people say their basic instincts are about fundamental values like liberty and security. They're going to kind of generally tend toward, hey, I actually think I would tend to lean toward security over liberty, whereas I've never seen that before, no matter the political alignment of the audience. So one of the most important things I want to remind people of when it comes to these issues is they are fluid. And they always have been. The dissent, the division, the divisiveness, the nastiness we're seeing in this country are not a natural feature of a political system. They are an intended feature of a political system. We are being driven to this level of division. And we are rewarding the people that do it.
Well, let's do this. Let's do a little wrap up. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and I've enjoyed our panelists. So I'm going to ask Dr. Frankel to give us some closing remarks, and then we'll come back to Dr. Stewart and ask him to do the same. Rich, are you ready?
Sure. I think, just kind of, again, thinking back to, being more of a pessimist, but, one of the lessons of the German experience really in terms of why it ended the way that it did, obviously with the death of democracy and the rise of Hitler, was not because it was inevitable. Historians don't talk about inevitability because nothing is inevitable except, obviously standards. But German democracy didn't have to die. But even if it was going to go through a period on life support, it certainly didn't have to end with the Hitler dictatorship. German history in this period of time is one of the greatest ways of teaching about contingency, and that things happen that don't necessarily are unexpected. People make bad decisions, unnecessary decisions, unexpected events occur, and so forth, that can shift in a different direction, in an unexpected direction. And so, we're on a path now that seems problematic, that is problematic, and that certainly has among its possible outcomes a very dark future. But that doesn't mean that that's automatic. I don't know, again, how that's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen by converting Trump supporters into Democrats, but things happen. I mean, again, and that is the reality that Germans were not autocrats by nature. They were not anti-Semites by nature. They were not violent militarists by nature. These things happened as a result of a variety of factors. And German democracy certainly could have survived. And again, if you look, for example, just to leave it, when I was younger, in the previous century, when people thought of Germany, reasonably or understandably, they thought of dictatorship, they thought of the Nazis and so forth. But if you look now at the overarching 20th century going to today, of course, the vast majority of German history now you would think of as overwhelmingly democratic and liberal, right? And those years of dictatorship seem much less dominating, right? Obviously, the outcome was tremendous and went far beyond the boundaries, but Germany right now can be seen as much more the story of democratic and liberal success than it was the history of dictatorship and violence. So, in the moment, things can seem dark and it's hard to see the way out of it, but, there are ways out of it, and the key is vigilance, really, fundamentally. You can't feel comfortable, 100% comfortable, because even in the good times, bad things can happen. And so you have to be aware. Democracy doesn't defend itself, right? It doesn't protect itself. It has to be actively protected, by the citizens who care. And so I guess that's a more hopeful answer than the one I gave previously. So. Oh, you're on.
Thank you. Yes, the obligatory mute mess up. All right, very good. I believe that we are headed toward a reconciliation. That reconciliation may take the shape of a civil war. It may take the shape of another global war. It may take an entirely different shape that we've never recognized before. We've already begun to understand in the last part of the 20th century that some of the most dangerous actors on the global stage are no longer state actors, right? These are independent groups and individuals who can get their hands on the kind of weapons that will allow them to create state responses. That is the kind of instability that we're facing as we move forward. And that kind of instability makes me very, very nervous. On the flip side, instability isn't automatically a bad thing. A system or a society that is too stable, that is too locked into its existence, into its institutional forms, its set practices, its rules, and its niceties, will allow things to fester to the point where they simply explode. So I want to caution us, when you look out there and you see the anger in the streets, right? When you see the smoke, when you see the violence, when you see the anger, when you see the protests, when you see the nastiness on social media, don't always and only see it as automatically something that's pushing us further towards civil war, because that kind of release and airing of tension can be the thing that diffuses conflicts within our society enough to avoid a civil war, right? The fever state can kill us. Maybe we hit a civil war to the point where we know we don't exist anymore as a country in a recognizable way, or it can cure us, which of course it will only do for a period of time until we have to face up to our issues once again. Now, the question that a lot of people ask me, so where's the line? Like, what's the difference between acceptable democratic disagreement and unacceptable disagreement? And the only thing that I can say is others have said this much better than me. So the last thing I'm going to do is share a quote from a favorite author of mine, James Baldwin. Here's his answer to the limit of civic disagreement. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. When we fail to acknowledge our history, in this case specifically with race, when we fail to acknowledge the current outcomes that are an intentional and avoidable result of that history, we are getting into very dangerous territory where we are telling an entire population the country you live in is no longer protection from the threats that you face in the world. It is the threat that you face in the world. That's when we get into dangerous territory. What you can do to move us forward is vociferously, loudly, actively dissent, and try to keep it in that space where we can disagree and still love each other. I'm going to stop there.
Well, I want to thank both of our panelists. I want to thank Dr. Wally Stewart, Dr. Richard Frankel, as well as all of our participants who joined us for another Constitution Day panel. And as all of our participants, I want to encourage you to go out and do right in the world, talk to somebody, and enjoy the weekend. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.